long before.
Welcome.
Even before that.
Welcome to Massey
I think
College.
as long as
and
she worked
welcome
with
to our
Massey.
special edition for Refugee Awareness Week. First, I want to acknowledge that Massey College is built on Indigenous lands, the lands of the Rwanda, the Seneca, and it is the treaty land of the Mississaugas of the Credit. We want to acknowledge our duty of stewardship toward this land and the great privilege that we have to be here. This is a very special edition of Refugee Awareness Week. We're back in person partly, and this is a hybrid event, so I want to thank both our in-person participants and also the people that are online. And I'm going to pass the mic right away to Henry Sally, who's been the brain behind this operation, and I want to thank him for his cooperation and for inviting Massey to be part of this very important week.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for welcoming us once again to Massey College. And I want to thank all the participants who are here and excited to engage in this very important conversation. Again, my name is Henry Sally, and this is the Refugee Awareness Week. This happens every beginning of the year, so usually end of February, beginning of March. We are always excited to partner with Massey College to ensure that we talk about these very important issues that affect people both in Canada but also the world over. We all know that global conflicts often arise as a result of different issues. Unresolved political contestations, religious differences, governance challenges, and natural disasters. Those are some of the matters that destabilize society. According to the World Economic Forum, conflicts and violence cost the world more than $14 trillion a year. And that's an equivalent of dollars per person, per living person on the planet every day. So the Refugee Awareness Week was created in partnership with Massey College to engage in these conversations to see what we can do to ensure that we mitigate some of these challenges. And without any further ado, I'm going to pass over the conversation back to the principal so that we can start this conversation.
Thank you. So today we have a list of very distinguished contributors. We're very privileged. And in a way, the fact that we have so many prominent people speaking about this issue in Canada speaks to the volume, to the issues that we want to discuss today. So I am first really grateful to have online, we have Gabriel Ndiyishimiye, who is the writer and the CEO of Founder Living Books. I'm going to introduce him more fully later. With us, Ghazal Harris, who's the Massey visiting scholar and was the first ombudsman of Afghanistan. We have a journalist from Afghanistan as well Hahad, who is at Massey College as a human rights journalist and is currently was working for the BBC and now is doing for Al Jazeera, I think, in a freelance way. I think we're joined as well online with Asha Patanjila, who is a poet, a social justice advocate. And so thank you for being with us, and I'll introduce you a little bit more fully as we proceed. And I've invited Professor Macklin, who spent her entire life in Canada trying to figure out how to improve the refugee system. And I've asked her to come and give us a few remarks just to set up a little bit how we approach this. What are the issues and why can't we get it right? I think is one of the questions that I asked her to do. She's been involved also in an evaluation project on the Syrian refugee experiment, and we are anxious to see what would motivate change in Canada for it to get better. So Audrey, if I can ask you to take the mic for, thank you.
Thank you so much for that kind invitation to speak. It is, and for the lovely introduction, it's a privilege to share a panel with the experts. I am a professor, but really the experts about a lot about the refugee situation are people who have experienced it and reflected upon it firsthand. So my role here is, I think, to kind of set the stage and then hand it over to the real experts. So I'll talk about a few things. The first is to talk about the global context, and then to put resettlement, refugee resettlement, into that global context. And if there's time, speak a little bit about my own research project in what's called private sponsorship of refugees in Canada. So the Refugee Convention is the international treaty that addresses refugee protection. And what it does is really protect people who meet the definition of a refugee, that is to say, who have a well-founded fear of persecution in their country of origin, from being forced back into that country once they have fled. That's what the Refugee Convention guarantees, what's called a right against refoulement, or entitlement to non-refoulement, non-return. That's pretty limited. In Canada, we don't actually receive a lot of people who flee on their own to seek refugee protection in that way. 85% of the world's refugee population, the people who have fled their countries of origin out of a well-founded fear of persecution, remain in countries close to, adjacent to the countries they fled from. That is to say, primarily in the global south. So the responsibility for protection of refugees falls disproportionately and heavily on countries of the global south, most of whom don't have a lot of resources themselves. Only a tiny fraction of people actually ever make it to what we consider the wealthy, liberal, democratic states of Europe, North America, Australia, New Zealand, and so on, Canada, to actually ask those countries to live up to the promise they made to provide protection by not sending people back. Tiny fraction of people. And yet, as you will know if you followed recent controversies around, for example, of people into Canada from the United States via Roxham Road, or if you observe what happens in the Mediterranean with the movement of people on boats and the ways in which they are repelled and mistreated and abused and left to drown and die in the Mediterranean, you will know how well countries do their very best to avoid living up to the obligations they voluntarily undertook to protect refugees. Now, apart from what I have just described, that is to say, the actual legal obligations that countries undertake under international law when they sign the Refugee Convention, there are other practices that some countries use to protect refugees, and one of them is resettlement. So resettlement is a practice by which states select people from abroad, usually people who have fled their country of origin and are right next door, as it were, in an adjacent country, and they select some number of those people and actually bring them to the country to be resettled as refugees and then to acquire what's called permanent resident status and then hopefully on to citizenship. That's the resettlement process. Unlike asylum that I began with describing, it's not underwritten by any legal obligation. So if you see asylum as a matter of law, and if I can say of justice, resettlement is a matter of what I'll call humanitarianism and discretion. States do it when they want to the extent they want to, in the numbers they choose. And what they like about it, frankly, is that they get to pick and choose who precisely comes. That's the program of refugee resettlement that Canada, in fact, is well known for and applauded for. But to put it in context, understand how very few people we receive through the asylum process. We accept more people, we select more people through resettlement, and we are celebrated, applauded for that. But even there, the numbers are very small. And let me just put that again into some global context. The United States High Commissioner for Refugees undertakes the task of identifying who among people who have fled their countries for reasons that would be recognized under the Refugee Convention and have arrived in an adjacent country, right? From among those, what are about 26 million people worldwide, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees identifies a subset of those who it thinks might really need to be resettled. That is, can't find appropriate safety where they are. And that number is tiny. And what I'm going to say here is about 1 in 20 people who flee are identified by the UNHCR as in need of resettlement. Okay? But others, only about 10% are actually resettled. So what that means is, cutting to the chase, the chances of being resettled as a refugee if you have fled your country of origin, about 1 in 400. Those are your odds. 1 in 400 refugees have a chance of being selected out of that lottery for resettlement. And I hope you can appreciate that those are lousy odds. And if you ask yourself why people, for example, might take desperate measures to flee on their own, to get on boats, sinking boats, or why they might stow away in ships, or why they might board with false documents, or why they might clamber onto trains or hide in the trunk of cars or travel across deserts to get to safety, remember that the odds of actually being selected for resettlement are about 1 in 400. So with that in mind, I'm going to say a little bit about, I'm supposed to come up with, I'm going to come up short, I'm promising you that. Let me just tell you right now. What I want to say is that, Canada is a country that resettles. So it does that, and it looks good compared to the rest of the world. That's only because the rest of the world is doing so little in resettlement. So I want to say resettlement's a good thing, but, and Canada is applauded, the numbers are tiny. What happens with resettlement in Canada, though, is we have roughly two streams. One, those whom the state takes primary and full responsibility for resettling. In a sense, the government pays the cost, supports people at a minimal level of income support for a year, and enables them to access various settlement resources. All of this is done on a limited budget, and candidly, it's never quite adequate enough for the purposes for which it's intended. The other stream is private sponsorship, where groups of people come together on their own, of their own accord, and they undertake to raise the funds that will provide that 1 year of income support, and also to do some of the heavy lifting of assisting people in what's called the integration of the settlement process, accessing language supports, language training, perhaps access to job support, education for kids, and so on. They do it for a year, and this often leads to, frankly, lifelong relationships between those who sponsor and those who sponsor. And my research project, just to say briefly, looked at people who came together to sponsor in this way, through private sponsorship, Syrian refugees after the 2015 exodus of Syrians. So my project really asked the question, let me back up and say, a lot of people did a lot of research on this movement, and lots of people were looking very closely at the people who came and their circumstances, why they came, how they came, what their experience of resettlement was and is. My project looked at the people who sponsor. Because the people who sponsor are more important, obviously not. The people who matter the most are refugees. But to put it in relation to policy choices. If you think resettlement of refugees is a good thing, let's assume we do. And if you think that community sponsorship, engaging ordinary people in the process of resettlement is a good thing, let's assume we do. If we think it's a good thing, then it's important to know or to figure out why people do it, what their experience of it is, so that they'll do it again, or they'll encourage other people to do it, so that process will continue. And so it was with that in mind, to understand what works, maybe what doesn't work in the process of sponsorship, that we embarked on the research. And we asked the following questions. Who sponsors? Why do they sponsor? What's their motivation? What's their experience of the sponsorship process? And what's the impact on them? Okay. And the way we posed the question was, and it's a little, to put it in short, in a brief way, succinctly, so if you back up and say, if you understand resettlement as a kind of process of facilitating newcomers who are refugees on a process toward becoming citizens ultimately. Then the question we asked was, how does the project of refugees into citizens remake the citizenship of sponsors? What does it do to them, for them? And in brief, I'll just say a few things. In terms of the demographics, who sponsors? Well, overwhelmingly, they're kind of people who look like me, white middle-aged ladies. And I flatter myself by saying middle-aged. White ladies of a certain age. 10 affluent. Why? Well, you got to be able to raise money for this, right? And either you're going to be able to cut a check, or you have a network where you can fundraise. Okay? Why do they do it? Well, a variety of reasons. I think a lot of people feel that they want to do something that is tangible. And a lot of people can make donations and write checks. For a lot of people, this represented an opportunity to feel like they were doing something meaningful, tangible, material that actually engaged them. Sometimes they did it because somebody asked them. Right? And so there's this idea of doing something as a project together, because it turns out there aren't that many opportunities when people come together to undertake a project, to do something that they think is the right thing to do, just because. Right? So actually, that was part of the motivation. What was the experience? The experience was, it was a long-term project of at least a year, and often longer, because relationships, they often endured. But it was most people said it was an overwhelmingly positive experience, but it was challenging. It was challenging for them, and it was challenging for people who were sponsored. There are sorts of issues that arise, and let me just describe them in a very superficial way. Want me to stop?
Conclude and
Okay. Got it. I have 15 minutes that I sort of allotted myself, but I can cut. That there's a huge power imbalance, right, between people who sponsor and people who are sponsored. That is obvious. And how that power imbalance it can be very challenging for everybody. Maybe I'll just leave it at that. Let me turn back then to the final question, which is, where to go from here. Why is it important? One of the things I'm interested in is looking at how did this process transform the people who sponsored, and in what ways? Did it activate them in ways that mattered in terms of promoting and advocating on behalf of refugees, not just sponsored refugees, not just the refugees they happen to sponsor, but refugees generally? Did the insights, the political, if you will, insights gleaned from this, do they matter for the larger project of compelling governments or pushing governments to do better when it comes to the global refugee issue? And that's sort of where I want to end up. That what matters about sponsorship is, of course, the individuals who are sponsored and resettled to Canada. But what also matters in sponsorship is whether this contributes to a kind of political activation that goes to the critical global questions that require not just individual action, but global coordination. Because what Canada does alone is not going to change this problem, this challenge. It has to be a global approach, one of coordination and cooperation, rather than cooperating as states tend to do and how to keep people out. It is about cooperating and finding constructive ways to share ability and include. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Audrey. And apologize. We were going to go and hear from Gabriel. Maybe you want to come and talk to us. Gabriel is a writer. He's based in London, Ontario. He's focused on refugee story, representation of exile. His first book, Run Elvis, Elvin, contains multitudes, history lessons on the cause and consequences of genocide, three-dimensional accounts of one man's refugee experience. And he's now the CEO and founder of Living Books to attract growing number of refugee and immigrant intellectuals who write about displaced people. So thank you, Gabriel, for being with us. And I think let's hear from what your experience was.
Yeah, thank you so much for allowing me this platform to share my thoughts on the refugee crisis and what Canada can do and Canadians can do basically to meet up the challenges that refugees elsewhere are facing. So I'm going to talk about the humanitarian crises that we are facing in right now, with an exception for the crises in Afghanistan, because I really don't know so much of what is going on in Afghanistan. I'm glad we have a panel member who is going to share more about that experience. So, from what we've seen so far, even since the start of Second World War, and then the post-colonial conflicts in Africa and elsewhere, um, we've seen that humanitarian crises are part and parcel of the political, economic, times that we live in, despite whatever time that could be. But they contribute so much, as Henry has noted, to our economic systems that we humans have basically built to support ourselves. I'm saying this because when a crisis happens, as a refugee crisis, for example, people get to build up their careers. Media take an interest, a very huge interest in that, and then later on, they tend to drop the subject when another crisis hit. People take an advantage of these crises basically to advance their career and to really show up how better they can report, or how better they can do better than others. And governments also take these as an advantages basically to advance their own political agenda in the time and period that they are in power. We've seen how it played out in the aftermath or during the Second World War, when Western governments were solely very much interested in solving the crisis in Europe, and when the situation, opened up in Africa, or in the global South, so to put it, they kind of so they solved their own crises at first, because it really concerned them. It was a European crisis that was created by Europeans, and when that was solved, we had crises elsewhere in Africa and elsewhere, and they did very little, because those conflicts had very little to do in their benefits, in their political objectives. So the early efforts to deal with conflicts in Africa were really very much minimal, but they are also similar to efforts that are being introduced right now to deal with the refugee crisis. In the 1960s, 1970s, and 80s, we saw the international conferences on assisting refugees in Africa, which is a very similar project to what is going on right now with the complementary refugee response framework. Basically, the idea was to help governments in Africa or in the global South address challenges of refugees within their own states, but while supporting developmental projects that were going on, with in that particular country. For example, a country could claim that it doesn't have enough resources to deal with the refugees, and they would claim that we need support. But the problem with that was that that support was basically being used by that same government to advance its developmental projects, leaving aside then those efforts basically went away because of the 1984, Ethiopian crisis, the hunger crisis, and then later on, in 2016 and 2015, projects like the complementary refugee response started coming up because of the crisis in Syria and elsewhere. So that's about it. I wanted to relate how the current refugee crises that we are facing in Russia and in DRC Congo contrast each other. They are similar in a certain way, but they are totally different. So we've seen how European governments or Western governments have responded to the conflicts that are going on in Ukraine. the response has been really very, very supportive because it's already close. The conflicts are happening at the borders of European countries, but also at the, uh, these governments really have tried as much as possible to prevent that conflicts from escalating. But in places elsewhere, like Africa, let's say in DRC Congo, we have seen very, very minimal reports um, uh, happening on the cause and the perpetrators of that conflict, right? And so I think what I would say is when we have a global crisis, a global refugee crisis, um, everyone, as much as possible, like individual people, would love to help and support, but also their efforts are basically discouraged by the by political apparatuses that that is undergoing on in their own country. So in Canada, people can support, can raise funds basically to resettle refugees. But as we know, resettlement really supports very, very few people. It's reported that at 1% of the refugee population get an opportunity to be resettled, in third world, in first world countries. And everyone wants to come to these countries because of the opportunities they offer, employment and stability and whatever you can mention. But what can we really do to solve the refugee crisis? That is a very big undertaking. It's a very big problem that I really don't think there is one way of dealing with it apart from raising awareness, on the current crises, sharing stories just so that people really get to understand other people's experiences, get to gain a deep understanding of what it is really to be a refugee, of what it is really to leave everything behind in search of stability, so that you a family can raise itself up, or parents can raise their children in environments that are conducive and stable. Canada is very lucky to the extent that most of the conflicts that happens they happen very far away from borders, and that is why uh, you know Canada hasn't so much been affected by the refugee crisis as we say, right? Because its borders are very far. But to countries, in Europe that have borders that are very close to where refugees are coming from, they they face, I would say, so much pressure basically to deal with those crises, and that is the reason why basically we've seen so very little efforts, because today they would try to save the refugee crisis, but then what happens tomorrow? The question is, are we going to keep our borders open to these outsiders until when? Because these kinds of issues will never really end. Uh, I would say like the refugee crisis you know, is a concern of everyone that should be concerned about, but we have done very very little to manage the crisis. And Western governments have done very little really help other countries, manage their own conflicts. So that they can stabilize and so that we can at least have a minimum number of people fleeing their homes, right? So what we can do individually, I think people should be educated about about these kinds of talk about refugee crises, and they should be open up basically to learn other people's experiences. We've talked about what we are doing On a personal level, I come from a refugee camp, but I'm from Rwanda, and now I'm Canadian, right? Our area is a sponsored refugee. But what I've seen after my education in Canada is that the very little I can do to support or is basically to raise awareness of the refugee issues and share a story of humanity, the experiences that we all people have common, and why our experiences or the places we come from or our racial backgrounds really matters very little if we worked together, so we created Live and Books basically to help out with people who wants to share their personal experiences or people who are writing about the refugee issues and migration. So it's a very inclusive platform. It also includes even Canadians, white Canadians who came here, generations ago. We very much know that they are immigrants as new refugees who are coming into Canada and they have stories to share. So um, if we opened up ourselves to share, our stories together, we would find connections that would link us up together. That should a crisis happen elsewhere, we would be humans will be willing basically to jump in and help out. But I don't really think that a resettlement is one of the is a solution, but it's not a durable solution to addressing the refugee issue. We should help other refugees elsewhere. Countries recover, from the refugee crises because Western governments have resources to do that. I'm not sure if I made
Yes.
much
No,
sense.
thank you. Thank you. That's why I was thinking about whether the Life and Books experience about telling one's story has provided some help or some relief or some ways of not only connecting people together, but feeling a sense that of appeasement, or is it important to tell your story? Was it important to you to tell your story?
Well, the project developed when I wrote my book, Run Elvin. I self-published the book, and then I set up basically to provide a platform. So we started a publishing company. So far we are working on our first publication by Emmanuel Muda, but we've received 4 new manuscripts that are going to be published this year. One of the manuscripts is written by a white Canadian who resides here in Ontario, who worked with an organization from London, Ontario, that helped in 1984 in Ethiopia when Ethiopia was facing its own refugees. So the author is talking about those experiences and how a community here in London, Ontario, organized itself and helped out. Not in terms of resettlement, but in terms of providing support on refugees in their location, and how the organization went on to help people afterwards when those.
Thank you. Thank you. We've talked about Afghanistan, and I think what Gabriel mentioned a little bit, almost a duty to report on what's happening somewhere. Otherwise, you cannot bring cognizant, you cannot get engaged, you cannot have a political community that actually wants action if they don't know what's going on. So let me ask, let's start with you, Ghazal, constitutional lawyer from Afghanistan, the only woman who was on the constitutional task force, so to speak, to write the constitution, was the first ombudsman, first woman to lead a law enforcement institution to task with investigation corruption in the Afghan government. You're here, Ghazal. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Natalie. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and to be part of this panel, both people in person and online. So when when I was looking at the program and when I was invited, I was thinking maybe I should talk about my own experience as a refugee, but also talk about what I think about overall the refugee challenges and what could be done or needs to be done. But it might be interesting to talk a little bit about, very briefly, about Afghanistan and the refugee crisis that we have had. So Afghanistan has been in conflict for a very long time. We are talking about late 1970s when conflict really started, and the first batches of refugees started to Afghan refugees that left the country and became refugees in other countries. And of course, the conflict has involved a mix of ideological, religious, ethnic, and factors. And part of this, of course, these conflicts have created a huge number of refugees that have gone to other countries, mainly neighboring countries, but also to the Western countries. And of course, one thing that that I do want to highlight is that the conflict has not just been an internal issue. There has been a lot, either manipulation or power struggle and rivalry, regional or international rivalries that has impacted or has significantly influenced the violence or the conflict. Now, with these conflict, of course, we've had different batches of refugees living in. These are in millions. And for a very, very long time, at least for 2 decades, Afghanistan used to be the largest or consisted the largest number of cases within UNHCR. For 2 decades consistently, Afghan refugees had the highest number of cases within UNHCR. But then, so at some point in time, we know Afghanistan had 50% or comprised the refugees at the international level. 50% of them were Afghans. And that was a huge number. That was like a record at the world level. And fortunately, that's what Syria went through a few years ago. And with that, we have also had a very high percentage, like a world record of repatriation as well. I'm highlighting that to say that that becoming a refugee is not always a choice. People are forced to leave. People are forced to become a refugee. Afghanistan had one batch of repatriation of nearly 1 million in 1992, but then the civil war broke out, and then people started to leave the country again. And in 2002, when the first Taliban government collapsed, we had more than 3 million voluntary repatriation of Afghans into the country. And that shows that if the environment is ready for the refugees and people, and if they are not at the risk of persecution, they always want to go back. I'm sure Zahal and I would be the 2 volunteers to run to Afghanistan if we know we and our families are going to be safe. Now, that's what basically a few numbers from Afghanistan. Speaking about myself, I've become a refugee twice in life. I was 12 when I first became a refugee, when the civil war broke and we had to go to Pakistan. I lived there for 10 years. I basically grew up there. And in there, I grew up with a lot of identity crisis because I didn't really understand what it meant to be a refugee, not being able to do a lot of things, why my parents cannot go to the office like they used to go back in Afghanistan, and my father had to even engage in labor. Why? I mean, why can't he go to an office like he did before? So grew up with a lot of those kind of crisis. But this time around in 2021, when we had to leave the country, I realized that it must have been a lot more difficult for my parents to be uprooted twice in the same manner, and for them to basically start a life altogether from scratch. And when we talk about starting a life, you're not just talking about just packing your bags and going and living in another country. It's never like that. It may appear to just a short story. Yeah, we left Afghanistan and then we came here to Canada, but behind every story of anyone who has been resettled, there are like months and months of suffering, and not just in the period before they resettle, but even when they resettle. I was just telling Zahal that a lot of people won't understand when I've been in Canada for 1 year now, and a lot of people will still don't understand when I tell them I am not resettled. I am not settled. I want to settle down. It just, there's so much with restarting. We're restarting a life. Like house, of course, furniture, God knows, plates, spoons, whatever, like small things to bigger things, but also your social network. You don't know a lot of people here. Restarting a social network is not easy. It has not been easy for me. Going through those mental health problems, missing your country, not being able to provide the kind of support you want to provide, the survival guilt, because it's not that the country is safe, it's still unsafe for millions of people. And the survival guilt sometimes doesn't let you sleep at night. And all those other kind of, restarting a career while your career was way in front of you and you're well established and you knew what you're going to do with your life. All of these are the kind of issues that don't let you settle down, even though you have settled, you have been resettled, you are in another country and you have been safe and secure. I think that is the part that I would like to stress more upon, that first of all, the fact that the refugees have reached a final destination does not mean that their suffering is over. They still struggle, they struggle a lot. I spoke English the way I do right now, and I came to Canada and I had a lot of issues. Imagine people who don't speak English, who have not used subways before and are even don't know how to go in there, taking their children to school, struggling. My family struggled for 2 months because nobody would rent their house to us because we did not have any, credit history or any records of here. You want to apply for a job, you don't have experience in here. The fact that you're born and you've arrived from Afghanistan raises a lot of, red flags. Are they terrorists? Who are they? And then to repeatedly explain yourself, who you are. And that is very, very painful because you keep trying to convince the person in front of you, you have come from Afghanistan, you're not a terrorist, you have suffered from terrorism, and you have run away from terrorism. All of these put a lot of pressure, pain, and the kind of things that sometimes is able and not easy to be explained. I think there's a lot in terms of the solution that needs to be done. First of all, these very lengthy processes for resettling people. Really, the world needs to look at that. I mean, how long? We have had refugees ever since human history, I believe, or at least in our recent history in the last century. But still, it takes us months and years to make decision on a case. My brother hasn't seen his children, who are 9 and 6, for 4 years. He's in Canada, and for 4 years he's been waiting for them to come to Canada. And imagine, I mean, a father not being able to touch growing children of age 9 and 6. And there are hundreds and thousands of such stories. Legal protection is extremely important for a lot of people. Going into a third country, not having any status, is a major issue. As Audrey said, the Global South is taking a lot of responsibility for refugees as a third country, but they need a lot of support. The UNHCR needs a lot of support, a lot of reform institutionally as well. Because right now there are millions of people, Afghans who are in Pakistan, who are stuck there. But UNHCR is extremely slow in even registering them as refugees so that they could legally stay in Pakistan. Their visas are expiring and then they have to go back to the country. So all of these processes, these legal staff processes, they need to be shortened and easier. I think post-settlement integration is extremely important. This is what I have seen. The government leaves all of that to the civil society organizations, which I think in a lot of ways do a lot of great work. But at the same time, I think the government should feel a lot more responsible for integration of these people into the society, because they really contribute. A lot of them come with a lot of skills that can contribute, instead of getting depressed or I don't know, getting addictions or just running around not knowing what to do with their life. If there are specific programs, it will really help not just the people but that government, because they're no more a liability but a contributing force. I think reunification, I think I told you just in a sentence about my own family how important that is. And I think the policies need to be both nationally and internationally. I think countries need to look at their own country specific policies to improve them. Canada is one of the examples that we see at the world level, but there's always room for improvement. And then imagine the kind of countries, fortunately, are really bad. They detain refugees, they deport the refugees, and sometimes they don't even shy away and saying, saying, oh, you're a big threat to our culture. And all of those, imagine who's on the other side of the this whole story and this whole xenophobia and discrimination and the fact that they're already going through a lot of pain, and imagine going all of that as well. So we need to look at it both from a national level as well as international level. Thank you.
So I think we have lots of ideas to discuss. Let's go to Anna, who's on the virtually. Do you want to speak to us? Can I see you? Yes, we are.
Oh,
Yeah,
it's
sorry.
me. I've been muted for a while.
For a while, so I just want to welcome you again, Asha, poet, now based in Canada, reciting poetry. She started reciting poetry in kindergarten, and by 18 years old, she practiced theatrical poetry with Guitar Nation, a poetry firm in Uganda, and she often performed at the Ugandan National Theatre. She left her country because of political instability in 2015, sought refuge with her family in Uganda, and inspired a book called Destabilize, where she explains the current political situation of her country and of the African continent at large. Asha, so happy to have you among us.
I'd like to thank you very much, for starters, for the opportunity you've given me to speak, because this is what I believe I have lived for as a person that has been a refugee, to have a platform to be able to express. So I think I'm going to start a little bit differently. As a poet, I like to be a little bit creative, and I'm going to recite a poem by Warsan Shire called Home. Warsan Shire was a Somali refugee who left her country as well due to political instability. And this was the first I publicly performed and related to as a refugee back in Uganda. So please allow me. No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. You only run from the border when you see the whole city running as well, and your neighbors running faster than you, bloody in their throats. And that boy you went to school with who kissed you dizzy behind the old tin factory is holding a gun bigger than his body. You only leave home when home won't let you stay. No one leaves home unless home chases you, fire under feet, hot blood in your belly. And even then, you still carry the anthem under your breath, tearing up your passport in airport toilets, sobbing as each mouthful of paper made it clear that you wouldn't be going back. You have to understand that no one puts their children on boats unless the water is safer than the land. No one burns their palms on the train beneath carriages. No one spends days and nights in the stomach of a truck feeding on newspaper. Unless the traveled mean more than just journey. No one crawls under fences. No one wants to be beaten. No one wants to be pitied. No one chooses refugee camps or strip searches where your body is left aching, or prison. Because prison is safer than a city of fire, and one prison guard in the night is better than a truckload of men who look like your father. No one could take it, stomach it. No one's skin would be tough enough. The go home blacks, refugees, dirty immigrants, asylum seekers, sucking up our country dry. Niggas with their hands out, they smell strange, savage. They messed up their country and now they want to mess up ours. Now tell me, how do the words, the dirty looks roll off your back? Maybe because the blow is softer than a limp toy, or the words are more tender than 14 men between your legs, or the insult easier to swallow than rubble than both. Then your child's body in pieces. I want to go home, but home is the mouth of a shark. Home is the barrel of the gun, and no one would leave home unless home chased you to the shore, unless home told you to quicken your legs, leave your clothes behind, crawl through the desert, wade through ocean and drown. Save. Be hungry, beg, forget pride. Your survival is more important. No one leaves home unless home is a sweaty voice in your ear saying, leave. Run away from me now. I don't know what I've become, but anywhere is safer than here. Yeah, thank you. That is
Thank you.
yeah, that's a piece by Warsan Shire that, as as a young person experience as a young person that has had to experience the whole situation, I related to in ways that I could relate to, and I feel like that was when the power of poetry came in, the power of the arts most especially. So that's why I was very encouraged to advocate using poetry and photojournalism. It starts back, excuse me, but it starts back in 1990s, when the Alliance of the Democratic Forces for the Liberation of Congo attack. We go to the RCD in 1998 to 2003, where the ADL, which was the Alliance of Democratic Force of Liberation, is attacked against as well. 2004, we have the Kivu conflict, and we have the CNDP rebels who yet attack again. In 2012, we have the M23 rebels, and in 2022, we have the M23 rebels yet again, and the country is called Congo. So I happen to be Congolese from Beni, North Kivu, and we are the ones currently suffering with the M23 rebels and other rebels who have come in before the M23. That, for starters, is tragic that so many people have to go through these situations, yet so many people don't know what's going on. So, for starters, awareness, awareness. In college, I remember in my first year of college, I wasn't able to interact with very many people. I came to Canada through a sponsorship as well. Under sponsorship, I was able to finish college, and in my first year of college, there was less interaction due to COVID because I came under COVID measures. But when I was able to interact with a she was Canadian, I told her, I'm like, hey, I'm a published author. I have a book called The Country Rise. And she's like, what is The Country Rise? And I told her it came from the word dépayser, a French word for dépayser, which may mean to be deculturized. Because I found myself deculturized, being born in South Africa, raised in Uganda, raised in Congo as well, raised in Rwanda, and then raised in Congo, and then leaving Congo to go back to Uganda because of the wars. I felt like I was deculturized. I felt like I didn't belong. And I explained this to her, and I told her, yeah, I come from Congo. Since 2014, my country has been going through a massacre, and to my surprise, she did not know. I was very, very concerned at the fact that she did not know that a country has been going through a massacre from 2014, and it was fast forward 2021, and she was unaware. And this gets me straight to the comparison of the Ukrainian situation and the situation happening in Congo, how the media was very quick to display this, yet stay silenced on the Beni massacres. So I was very, very touched, and I found it upon myself to continue to speak to everyone that I encounter that, hey, Beni is going through this situation. I come from Eastern. This is what's happening in Congo. This is what's happening in Northern Kivu. And there are so many people dying. By 2004, there were 5.4 million people registered to have died in the wars happening until then, but yet we still don't know how many more people have died until 2022. So um that was that's Benny. This is why I find it necessary to speak about it, but also I do want people to act about it. Just I want to act, my what I would desire is for the artist. I feel like as the artists are very unconsidered, but I thank God for. I do not necessarily thank God for COVID, but the effect that artists began to be regarded to a particular extent where they could portray their arts and people actually paid attention because people had nothing to do. And I feel like we need more exposure. We need more places, more events like this where we get to talk and get to tell people about what's going on because people cannot act on what they do not know about. And I find something very necessary that Gabriel said is understanding situations. And I feel like if people understood the stories individually, it would bring more perspective and it would bring much more action, especially the young people. This was continuously, if there were more events like this for people in colleges, people in high schools, this would be very great as a form of exposure. Um, yes, that is almost
Yes,
everything
thank
I have
you.
to say for now.
Yes, thank you, C, and thank you for your work as well, and thank you for reading
We,
this wonderful poem. I
the,
think it brought home, I think, much of the feelings that need to be on the table. Let's now move
yes.
to the journalist on the panel here, where we've been discussing a little bit the role of the media in hiding stuff, in not reporting, uh, in highlighting some conflicts, not others. Is that something that bothers you? How do you feel now that you're a displaced journalist in a way, that you're here still reporting a little bit on Afghanistan, but what story?
Thank you so
Yes,
much, Natalie, and thank you, everyone, the audience and panel. I'm very honored to be in this panel, both online and in person. Um, so what you mentioned is a very critical point, because it really matters in terms of how people respond, or in terms of policies and in societies. Afghanistan is one of the biggest humanitarian crises now. Like, it experiences one of the biggest humanitarian crises in the world now. And unfortunately, it's a bad time for the whole world. And at the same time, there are many conflicts occurring in the world. And there is a saying that the world only tolerates one conflict at a time, which unfortunately turns to be right. And we see that Afghanistan in the beginning was the focal point of all the news, all the humanitarian aid, and it was the headline every day. But especially after Ukraine crisis happened, the attention gradually moved, and it is mostly because it is more in approximate location to the Western world, and it soonly or easily can affect this Western world. And that's why Afghanistan had been getting less attention in that terms. But I think it's very important for us as reporters and for media to report, and to report in a way that gives a character, like refugees or people, victims of conflicts. They are not only numbers, they are not only people in a country, they are human who experience those things in person, and it really changes their lives. So yeah, it really matters. And I think it matters the way that the government respond to the cases of refugees from certain countries. I'm in direct contact with people from Afghanistan who have submitted cases to different countries, and they are living in limbo in different countries for years now, like for 2 years, and it's a lot. Like, I've been in contact with people in Tajikistan, Turkey, and Pakistan, especially a lot of people, because Pakistan is near to Afghanistan and they are more familiar with it. They tend to go there, but the process, as Ghazal mentioned, is very slow, and it takes a lot of time, and it's very frustrating for those people who are living there, because most of them do not have a valid document to be able to live there, because their visas are already expired. They don't have financial support to live there. Even those think about if they have some amount of saving, how long would that be able to run them? They are done with that saving too. They don't have place to stay. They don't have anything. And what I hear from them, especially those who submitted cases to Canada, they are saying that the process is slow, one, and the second, they don't have any clarification on the process, even if they are approaching IRCC or other organization who act as a mediate between them. They don't get any information. Like what they get is, we don't know. Wait, your case is submitted, but we don't know when will it happen. I know people who have done their biometrics, medical up, and interview, but still they have been waiting for a year at least to get their flight, and it's very frustrating. And also, so as a journalist, I'm always in contact with people, and because this is an area of my work, it really makes me think about them and really affects me differently.
Yes.
And I think it's very needed to share those feelings with the world, and that's through writing. And as a journalist, especially as a freelance journalist that I am now, it's very hard to get your pitch approved.
Yes.
And for media to give journalists to tell their own stories, which I have been always focusing on and very insisting in people being able to tell their own stories. And it's very important. It really makes a big difference, rather than being told by others who have little or who have knowledge, but they don't have living experience. So it really matters. So that's something that I, as a freelance journalist, had experienced, is not being able to get
These
the
voices.
platform. Yeah.
So if I mean, we have a little bit of time, and I want to open it up for questions, but let me summarize some of the things I think that the duty of everyone to know what's going on around the world and to recognize conflicts in the Congo and in Afghanistan and elsewhere. A little bit our simplistic view of the world that tends to be lack of curiosity, lack of demand for meaningful reporting that is for the whole world and not just the things where interest are at stake. So that's the first thing that I heard. Second thing I think is the basic lack of fairness or information in the process and the length of time. The time it takes is time that is lost in one's life, and that has repercussions in so many ways. I've also heard, I think, and maybe we could talk a little bit about what people in Canada can do outside of getting to know better what's going on, but a sense in which the process of resettlement is longer than a year. And it's interesting that all the programs are fixed on that 1 year, which seem to be disconnected from the reality of world. So other issues that and you're having trouble getting published or getting heard, having the voices of people being heard. Audrey talked a little bit. I wanted to know, Audrey, did people that participate in the private sponsorship indeed transform their action into political action eventually, or did that work?
I think it's fair to say that some do and many don't. But I don't think that, in a sense, that's surprising. I think, some people become repeat sponsors, so they may continue to engage. But whether, there's a way in which sponsorship for many people is, they understand it as depoliticized.
Yeah.
So the move from understanding the political dimensions and scaling it up to that is a move that some people make, others don't.
Giselle, you also spoke of different things that you'd like to see done. Are they things that you've been thinking about in terms of the system for both Canada and internationally, as you mentioned, in terms of what are the reforms you'd like to see at UNHR in terms of governance? The long list.
I think that's a lot for the UN to go through a lot of reforms. I think for Canada, I mean, I've been talking about this, and I hope I'm not repeating myself to some people here. I think I've been focusing on two things quite a lot since I've come to Canada, and I think one is the question of agency for the refugees.
Okay.
To make sure that the refugees are part of this whole decision making. They're part of the group, right? They have a seat on the table and are able to talk about their stories. That is extremely important. Secondly, I think it's also a question of mental health. I think the importance that mental health is getting around the world is great. It's extremely important. But I think that the part of the refugees was extremely important is to keep that in mind, that any refugee, regardless of how resilient they are, regardless of how strong they are and or appear to be okay, they should definitely get free mental health support. I will not be shy to say I have still go through very, very difficult times. Just trying to process what has happened, the trauma, the pain of leaving the country. I mean, all of that really takes a toll on you. And then just to assume that refugees have arrived at last country, they're good. That, I think that assumption should not be there.
That's offensive.
And one more thing that I'll add to this, and Sahal talked about this as well, I think it's important to note that a refugee is a refugee. No refugee life is less important, or no, the life of one refugee is not less than the right of another refugee. Canada had agreed to evacuate and resettle 40,000 Afghans. This was done in 2021 after the Taliban took over. And the last figures we have that Canada has managed to bring like 29,000 people. And of course, the Ukraine crisis impacted the process of evacuation and resettlement of Afghans significantly. And then on the other hand, you see that Canada has managed to bring more than like around 100 and 200,000 Ukrainians to Canada, which is great. I mean, being a refugee, I understand what those people are going through, but that does not mean you completely shut down or completely slow down one part of the crisis or one group of people and all your efforts and attention to the other. Both require attention, both need to be treated equally, not to like make one important than the other.
And I've also heard from both of our hybrid panelists the importance of space and platforms for the arts. You had to create your own publishing world. You are kind of performing your poetry. So the role of the arts to communicate the reality of the refugees' experience, but also to empower people to kind of speak with their voice, get really heard about what happened to them. Is am I summarizing it appropriately, Gabriel?
Yeah, so I think I would say overall that my message would be basically to go beyond the refugee politics, right? For an average Canadian, basically to understand the politics on the refugee crises and how basically they can better themselves or open up their minds basically to understand other people's experiences without putting or crowning them with the label the refugee, because the moment you crown someone with the label of the refugee, it takes away their humanity. And so what we are trying to do with Live and Books is basically to share those stories and these experiences and explain to people who haven't been through the refugee experience how, if they were in the same position, or how things could just really turn out abruptly, and their experiences would be the same. So it's basically to move beyond the refugee politics and look at the entire refugee crisis on a very personal level, a level that a person can connect based on their spiritual belief, or based even on their just personal values, right? And basically be able to help people from elsewhere because they feel that connection or that humanity connecting them, without politics intervening in the actions that they want to take, either in a group or either individually.
Let me open it up to the audience here for questions. I have a few questions already. Noah, and then Henry, and answer. Yes. Okay. Is there?
Hi, so I'm Noah Khan. I'm a junior fellow here at Massey College, and my question is about discourses around refugees. And I'm wondering how you all navigate kind of discourses that are hostile to refugees. So in Ontario, you have the Ontario First kind of discourse. In Europe, you have a lot of anti-refugee rhetoric about culture and incompatibility of cultures. And so I'm wondering how you navigate that, whether you try to change minds, whether you try to speak your own piece louder, or how do you approach those discourses?
Yes, well, let's start. Ghazal, if you feel up to it, and then Zuad, and then we'll go also to Gabriel and Asha. Yes.
Honestly speaking, since I've arrived to Canada, it's been 1 year now, and I haven't had any instances where I was treated differently or discriminated against. Of course, I am unhappy with Canada's overall policy in terms of keeping refugees at an equal level, like treating all refugees as equal. That's something that I would focus on. But in terms of like Europe, I went for a conference in October to Europe, and I was coming back, and for some strange, I missed my flight, and I was in Frankfurt Airport. And the lady who was sitting in the information desk to provide support for people like myself who have missed their plane was extremely rude to me and refused to double check a number she had given me for Canadian Airline. And it was only because of my hair color and my skin color, and she realized I was a refugee. And I at that point in time, I honestly speaking, the first thing that occurred to me, and it's not, I've traveled a lot, I cried. I had no idea what to do. I started crying. And I'm not an easy crier. It takes me, like, you really need to try hard to make me cry. And it has its own reasons. But I started crying because the treatment itself made me so sad, so hurt, that I couldn't do anything but cry. And she refused to tell me where could I make a phone to the Canadian Airlines. She told me to go buy a SIM card from an electronic store. Yes, I'm talking about Frankfurt Airport, October 2022. And so I go to that shop, and I'm all crying, and I'm telling the guy I need a SIM card, and he's like, "How long are you staying in Germany so I can give you the SIM card?" And I'm like, "I'm leaving Germany. Why do you need a SIM card? I missed my flights, and I need to do." And that guy happened to be from Pakistan, and he's like, "No, you're not going to buy a SIM card. You're going to use your own. I mean, here." And he was just a shop selling things. So how do we navigate through that? Sometimes it is difficult to comprehend. Sometimes it's difficult to even take it in. Like, why? What is wrong with me? Right? I'm a human being, and I'm in your country, and I'm not coming in. I'm leaving your country. So you better help me leave sooner. I think the best is, as Sahal said, is for us more about it. I think a lot of people take it just for granted that the fact that we have been given citizenship or permanent residency is that we have been privileged. And for a lot of time, I think one more thing that I've been saying, and sometimes I'm not politically correct about what I say, but I will say it here again. Countries that treat us like that are at least have a part in what's going on in my country, right? And that's what they forget. And at times, that's what happened to me in the airport is not a place for me to look at that woman and say, you know what? I mean, partly NATO failed in Afghanistan, partly the US failed in Afghanistan. And that is why you got all the refugees here. In question of Syria, it was not just an internal conflict. The world was involved. There were rivalries, regional, international, superpowers involved. Why do you always think the problem is in the refugee? You don't have that opportunity all the time. You have opportunities here, but sometimes these forums do not connect with those people who are sitting there and treating it like that. I think the more there's awareness, the more there's human talk to talk, I think eventually we might be able to change viewpoints, but I think it's difficult. It is very, very difficult. Sometimes I just give up and I cry. That's how I navigate.
Asha, anything that you want to contribute here?
Giselle said it all. Like, it's basically awareness and communicating. Because there's been several situations in Uganda where I found myself crying, especially when we'd go to like the office of the prime minister to get like our documents regulated or situations like that. And there are very many situations I know of refugees who still face of the aftermath. I was interviewing someone last year. And he happened to be a refugee from a Somali refugee rather, a Somalian refugee. And there's a situation that he faced. It was very, very interesting. So the situation he faced is when he came to Canada, he continued in his character. He continued in his, and every Friday he'd go to the mosque dressed in his, for lack of better words, I'd say kanzu. I've forgotten what they're called, but the Muslim robes that they dress in to go and pray with, and his turban too. So every time he'd dress up like this and take the TTC, he'd realize that everyone would not get close to him. Like no one would want to get close to him. And so this happened once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, and eventually he figured out people probably think I am whatever they think I am. So I think I don't like how this feels for me. So he changed and he started going with his jeans and t-shirts to the mosque. And for me that was sad because I felt like he was losing his culture. He was losing his religion to try and assimilate because he feels rejected by the society. So awareness is key. People need to stop limiting people to stereotypes, especially refugees. Refugees are just as much people as other people, and something people need to constantly be reminded of. And refugees themselves, refugees need to also be reminded. And I think Giselle talked about this as well. She talked about therapy sessions. We do need therapy, free therapy sessions. It's until last year that I realized that I had trauma from war that happened back in 2012. I did not know till I started getting therapy sessions. And there are tons of refugees that face these things. And there's so many situations that happen to refugees that minimize them and make them feel like they don't deserve to be part of the others, or they're not as much as the others. We could give an example of victims of war. Very, very, very many refugees from Congo are victims of very many of them are victims of rape, and by the time they're out of that circumstance, they feel less than everyone else. So they need to be reminded that they're just as much people as other people. And yeah.
Thank you.
Yes. So I just wanted to add something. It's what I've seen so far is the lack of interaction between refugees and the people of that origin country. Like I see refugees being segregated, like automatically when they come, they go to their own communities, which I think affects this mindset. Like when you say I'm from so and so country, it brings automatic background to the mind of the person you're talking to. So increase in the interaction between refugees and the people, it makes a big difference, because then they have this conversation about who they are, how their culture is, and it washes out all those stereotypes, I think. Yeah.
Other questions? There was yes.
Thanks. My name is Allison, and I'm a Massey Junior Fellow. And first of all, thank you for sharing your stories. I can't imagine it's easy. And my question focuses on humanity. And I wanted to ask, considering that you've gone through so much and you've been through one place after the other, where is your sense of belonging, or rather, what is belonging to you here right now in this moment? And my other question to you was for the people, for the folks who do sponsor refugees, do they have any fears or apprehensions engaging in this system? And if they do have these fears, what exactly are they?
Difficult questions here about that. Well, why don't we start with Gabrielle? A sense of belonging?
So yeah, so as I said before, my focus has dramatically shifted from presenting my in this category of a refugee who with an experience, who is invited in conferences basically solely to share their experiences and surrender his entire story to the audience or the experts who are there, who are invited also to come to that conference, and then move on with life as usual. I did that in the past. But then later on, you come to understand when you are sorely so much involved in the refugee field, the refugee studies field, that it not only you are being tokenized in so many ways, and you are sorely molding yourself and you are molding your career to become this figure who is going to share about his experiences to the experts, and if you deviate from that, your career ends. So in other words, if you've already built that profile of yourself as, quote unquote, a refugee expert who will talk about this and this and this in conference, you have to keep perpetuating that. So I shifted and started, thinking of myself as a Canadian, putting all that refugee experiences aside. It's not what makes me. It was part of a human experience that I went through, and everyone goes through that experience. And everyone here in Canada, as much as I'm concerned, apart from Indigenous people, everyone comes from everyone else, regardless who you are born here, where your great parents come from, everywhere, come from somewhere else. So one way we are immigrants to this country, with exceptions to Indigenous people. So I started thinking of myself, what do I have in common with all these people who I have encountered throughout my life experiences, either in Africa, either through my travels and here in Canada. So I said, okay, have in common is humanity, is human experience, and how can you share that experience basically to let people understand who you were on a very human level, so that they understand your worries, they can understand your needs, and they can understand also the ethos that you are trying to build so that you can have this belonging, right? The ethos that you are putting into that so that you can belong to that particular place. And then my task is basically now, okay, how do you expose the barriers that you are facing? Not because you were a refugee or you are a refugee, but because the society that you are living in is not accepting you solely because you don't fit in. You don't fit in because of your racial background. You don't fit in because of your accent. Uh, you don't fit in because you are not conforming to the rules of that particular society. So in other words, after you've gone through all those experiences, the only thing that you remain battling with is how do you move beyond your refugee experiences and build a community of people who will understand you and support you as a human and respect you as an equal, right? So one way to do that is basically to to find people who can understand you, and to find people who can respect you. But that also comes at a cost, right? It comes at a cost of risk, personal connections, because you don't want to be in the bracket of people who are being tokenized. I would say it comes at a cost, but it's a cost. It's a risk that is necessary. That a person who has gone through traumatic experiences of being a refugee has to take in order to rebuild those. I would say so far is basically find a community of people who understand you, who you are, and who respects you, and then build a community with them, and then move on. Uh, Shunning away from your past experiences, because they are things you went through, but they did not really define who you are, or they did not say anything about what you want to achieve and what you want to get at the end of this life. So
Anyone else? And other specific questions to you as well.
Thanks for your question. I'm not sure I understood what you were getting at, so I'll start, and then you can tell me if I've missed the content of your question. The fears and apprehensions that people had, well, I think people who enter into refugee sponsorship are actually quite keen on sponsoring people who are not like them. It's important to them that they are understood to be reaching out to a different, some different community. Now, one of the things that happens is, I think what Zuhal was saying was necessary, was just people do form relationships. And over time, those relationships lose, then it's, the relationships may be really great relationships or not so great, as they are between human beings, right? So people aren't necessarily going to feel an affinity to somebody else just because they happen to be thrown into a particular kind of relation. So some work better than others. I think sometimes at the outset worry about differences between themselves and the people who are being sponsored that are going to be very significant, like political differences and cultural differences and so on. And I would say that in the research I've done with, almost 100 sponsors, I suppose, who were interviewed, and another 500 or 600 who were surveyed, rarely were conflicts about, big cultural differences, whatever you imagine them to be, religion, or political views about a particular subject, the Middle East, whatever it is, right? There were issues were things like smoking, right? Or buying a car on limited funds. Now, I will say, though, that gender was actually a kind of recurring theme that did come up as an issue. So I will say that was something that there was often struggle around that. Not so much struggle over issues of sexuality. Sometimes the people who were sponsored were gay, or there was somebody gay in their family. Sometimes somebody in the sponsorship group was gay, lesbian, queer, whatever. Those people thought those might be an issue. Frankly, they weren't. People just get on with living and accepting and all of that. So I would say that it's not that there weren't issues, but I don't think the big fear, the kind of apprehensions that people might imagine about differences, those often weren't the ones. The issues did, I think, turn power dynamics, however, about which a lot more could be said. There's no doubt that these relationships are racialized. They are built on colonial difference. They are differences in status, in class, in all sorts of things that play out in these relationships. Often, I think people didn't anticipate them. They weren't apprehensive about them, fully thought through those implications. So, thanks.
Other questions? Do you have a question, Henry? It's your yes. Go ahead.
I do have a question. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for sharing all these stories. One concept that I haven't had anyone talk about is the deportation concept. I know some of you have spoken about the issue of resettling taking a long time and building connections here, social capital and stuff like that. We haven't interrogated the issue of deportations. And I wonder if that is also something necessary to talk about here, because it has come up a lot, especially within the African community. saying people have come to Canada, spending a lot of time here, 2, sometimes 3 years, and then being told that you're not acceptable to be here, you're not good enough, or your story does not. So you have to pack up your bags now and go back. Some even have families here. They have created different social capital here, different social networks with around themselves. They have stabilized, and now, and I think that also connects to the issue of mental health. So if someone has left their country, especially given that the rotary system of choosing who comes is like picks very small people, and people sometimes decide to come on their own. How can we ensure that the government understands that if someone has come here, they have been productive, they have contributed to the society, and they have family here, they are not at a later date deported to their what they call a country where they have run away from to come and get protection here. But also, I wanted us to interrogate what we can do to translate these conversations to actual policies that politicians work upon to implement.
So who wants to take the Audrey, do you want to talk about the legal framework for deportation and how it has been challenged and continues to be challenged, it mostly on an individual basis as opposed to politically, but
Most of our conversation today has been about resettlement. When somebody is selected for resettlement, they are given permanent resident status upon arrival and ultimately on a path to citizenship, at which point you are non-deportable. Remember, I began by distinguishing between resettlement and the asylum system. People who come on their own initiative as asylum seekers are the ones who are vulnerable in the way that you say. They are the ones who come and say, I meet the definition of a refugee. You, Canada, promised you wouldn't return people who are refugees to their country of origin. And you're talking now, the question you have is about people who, rightly or wrongly, the state has said, no, we don't think you're a refugee, and so we're going to deport you. There is a whole lot to be said about that, about our detention and deportation regime. I think the reason it hasn't gotten much attention here is that people who come who are resettled aren't vulnerable to that particular kind of hardship. But of course, there's much to be said about it. I just don't want to take up too much space with that right now, but I can.
and
Can I add to that
yes,
quickly? I think in Afghanistan, we understand the same issue. There has been a lot of deportation from Europe in the past 5-6 years. There has been a huge number of deportations with the refugee crisis that the world witnessed in 2014-15. There was a huge group of Afghans who left, and a lot of them went through a lot of difficult and different routes to get to Turkey, and then from Turkey to go to Europe, only to get humiliated there, to get detained there, to get deported back to Afghanistan. I think there are a lot more difficulties. At least some of the stories, very few stories that I know, is people basically giving up their whole life's earnings, selling their house, selling whatever assets that they had, in order to go to Europe, let's say, and then only to be deported. And then they come back, if they can make it come back, and if of course, at that point in time, they really don't have anything to restart their life based on it. There has been instances of suicide. There has been instances of people going through a complete mental breakdown because they don't know what to do with their life to restart now that they have given everything up. So it is a lot more sort of more difficult process than even this whole refugee process, because they go through what we go through, and then at the end not ending up being resettled, and then going all the way back, not knowing where to restart from.
there's a real cruelty to
Absolutely.
to that. And to your second point, Henry, about next steps, and first of all, I think this is a very important week to have, and to have at Massey, and to continue to have conversations, particularly as we explore and see what we can do here to be more responsive in the way that we can. But the second mandate is always to expand beyond the borders, and to make sure that we invite other people to account, to take account, or to continue the pressure that needs to be put. One of the reasons why I'd invited Audrey is that there's some group at Massey that want to do more work on the the refugees reset issues, and so we're hoping that we'll be able to contribute in some fashion. I think listening to the voices, as you said, Giselle, the people have to be on the table to design that research project. I think that's the first thing to do. So I hear that very, very much. Let's see what we can do, but let's promise to not give up on this at the minimum. Give up on continuing to have this conversation, the duty to listen, the duty to inform ourselves about what's going on in the humanitarian crisis around the world. Maybe I'll just invite our panelists to last remarks before we move on. Why don't we start with you, Asha?
Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup. As I'm becoming bilingual in Quebec, my French is improving by day. Someone talked about humanity, and I remembered a philosophy that every single day since I learned about it, I'm beginning to understand. As I mentioned, it's been hard for me to, it was hard for me to find a sense of belonging everywhere I went. Everywhere I went, I was different. My accent was different. Probably the way I looked was different. The way I spoke to people was different. But then when I heard the word humanity, I was reminded of Ubuntu, which is a Bantu term that signifies humanity. And under Ubuntu is the Ubuntu philosophy. And this is, I think, one of the most famous African philosophies that you will hear a lot of sportsmen talk about, a lot of leaders talk about. And under the Ubuntu philosophy, there's a word. I say this every opportunity I get to. Umuntu, ngumuntu, ngabantu. Which is, yeah, in simple terms, I can translate that I am because you are, and because you are, we all are. I'm not going to lie. It's not, you can't find, nothing is ever the same. Nothing ever feels like home. For a person like me, I don't know where my home is, like I can't tell you that home is in Congo when in Congo all these things are happening, or I still don't identify me as one of them, or home is in South Africa, or home is in Uganda. I've learned that home is in everyone that I get to meet and share an experience with. And just like that, it takes everyone to make the world home for everyone. And the effort is in all our hands. It's up to all of us. So when we remember, it's through unity, it's resilience, it's through love combined, and like really understanding people's perspectives and listening more like that. That's literally it. That's as much as we can offer sometimes. Sometimes we don't have much, sometimes we don't have money, sometimes we're not very eloquent speakers, sometimes we can only give a listening ear, and sometimes that's all it takes. So yeah, embracing people, and please read about the Ubuntu philosophy any opportunity you get. This is as much as I can give for now. Educate yourself more on the Ubuntu philosophy and stay encouraged in it. Once again, Umuntu, Ngumuntu, Ngabantu, I am because you are, and because you are, we all are. I can't on my own, and neither can you. Thank you.
That's such wise words. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So, Gabrielle, do you want to share last thoughts?
So my last thoughts really are all about first of all, to refugees, newcomers here in Canada who are struggling to find a family, so to say, or who are struggling with the sense of belonging. I would say that as much as possible to find people who understand you, people who respect your experience, people who will basically connect with you because of what you are, the human person you are, and build a relationship with them. To the people who are looking forward, or who are wanting to know how can we help resolve the refugee crisis, well, I would say on a very personal level, the starting point is learning about what is going on worldwide, and basically filtering the information that you're getting from the media, and just being conscious of the politics around the refugee crisis, and getting out a point of your own that connects your personal experiences to what other people elsewhere are experiencing. I think that is the first point. If you can support a person, well, that is very good, very encouraging. But just learning about other people's experiences, and understanding their personal and their suffering is a very good starting point to help out with the refugee crisis.
Thank you. Your last words. Let's.
I hope this is consistent with what Gabriel and Asha were saying. It's a paradoxical thing to say, but I kind of think we have to normalize refugees in two ways. One, to understand that the forces that lead to people leaving their countries are bad, they're predictable, and in that sense normal. They're not crises, they are predictable outcomes. And when you stop treating them as episodic, unforeseeable, sudden crises, and start thinking, we know this is going to happen, how are we going to plan for it and share responsibility for it, because we have played a role in the production of the conditions that have resulted in this, I think you end up in a different place. And the response to Ukraine is a good example of saying, we're not going to, we know people are going to move. Let's start planning on how that's going to happen in a way that is going to be less disruptive, traumatizing than it could otherwise be. We don't see that in other movements, and maybe we should, and there are reasons why we haven't seen them in other movements, but they're not about the situations, they're about our responses to them. And I guess the other way in which I think about normalization is to understand, I'm sitting here with people who are refugees, I'm sitting here with people who are poets, artists, journalists, legal scholars, right? Everybody is a complicated human being, and who is not defined solely by the refugee experience. And there has to be a way of, and I think this is consistent with what Gabriel was, respecting the refugee experience and understanding that everybody is a full human. And so in both those senses, I think as a policy matter, but as a personal matter, to think about normalizing refugees and the refugee phenomenon is important.
Thank you. Giza?
I want to finish by answering your question, the question of belonging. It's very complicated, really. I'm here in Canada, and logically speaking, I want to belong here. Being rational, and I'm trying to belong here. I'm doing whatever I can on my part. But emotionally speaking, my heart, my soul, my mind, it's all of it belongs to Afghanistan. And I want to go back, and that's where I belong. Since I have known myself being connected to that country. And I had thousands of opportunities. I decided to stay there unless I had no choice. And it wasn't just my life at risk, but my family's life at risk. So I think the question of belonging is not solely on our side, on the side of the refugee, but it's also on the side of the society, how the society embraces us, and then whether we belong there or not. When I first came to U of T, I met wonderful, wonderful people, and I'm sure they were all well-intentioned. A lot of people were very sympathetic to me in terms of, oh my God, I'm so sorry what has happened to you, da, 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 da. And then you don't have to pressurize yourself. Don't do anything. It's okay. Take your time. Enjoy your time at U of T. Connect. Which initially I appreciated it, but it not helped me because I was sinking down, and these sympathies were reaffirming what was happening to me, and I felt like I was being victimized, and I was further victimizing myself without really understanding what I was doing. And then on the other hand, I met people who told me, Oh, I'm so sorry you went through that. So what's next? What do you want to do? Are you thinking of writing a book? Do you want to do this? Do you want to do that? Do you know the organization that does this? Trust me, these behaviors make a huge difference in terms of where do you want to belong, whether you want to belong in that society that's embracing you, that is already envisioning you as somebody who can contribute and do something, or whether they're like, take your time, relax. You've gone through enough. I was literally told on so many instances that I had 1 year of fellowship at the University of Toronto and I literally didn't have to produce anything. And I said, no, I want to do something because at least for 1 year, I haven't done anything. I feel useless. And unless I do something, I will continue to feel useless. And that's not going to get any better. And I think I once somewhere, and it stuck with my mind for eternity, I guess, which said life takes us to different places, love brings us home. So it's the love, but at the same time, that sense of belonging comes from both sides. It's never one-sided. It's how the society embraces you and whether you have the willing to be part of that society.
Thank you so much. And so my last points would be, this awareness week is a very good opportunity for all of us as individuals to educate ourselves on these crises and the experiences people do experience, like their own stories, not seeing them as refugee, not seeing them as numbers, not seeing them as someone who had been not as privileged, but now they are privileged to be in a place safe. Of course, this is good, but we should think about they have gone through those things, and it matters. And secondly, I will again continue the interactions between people, and because it helps us to really understand those people and really read their stories to them. So yeah, thank you so much, everyone, and thank you, Natalie.
Yes, well, thank you all. Thank you to Gabrielle, Asha, and Zual, Gizael, and Audrey for being here, and to the audience for being present. And let's continue to listen to each other.
And thank you, Natalie.